Black Hollow lay under a torn sky where the clouds no longer moved like normal clouds, and a living void stared down through a WIDE Chinese letter in the heavens. The land below was full of broken towers, ash roads, and silent villages, while cold wind carried the smell of soot and old war. People still lived there, but they lived like shadows. Because the kingdom had fallen after the demon waves came through the west wall and never stopped. In the middle of that ruin stood Kael, a man in blackened steel armor with short brown hair, tired blue eyes, and a calm face that hid a great burden. He was the last oath-bound knight of the Old Crown, and he carried the Null brand, an iron relic that could weaken demons and tear through their magic. Yet each use slowly poisoned the mind of the bearer. Kael did not want glory, and he did not want revenge. He only wanted to keep the last people of Black Hollow alive long enough to see one more dawn. But the problem was larger than survival, because the demon Lord Thorn had begun a new plan. And if Kael failed, the whole kingdom would be swallowed by the abyss. Thorn had found the shattered pieces of the royal crown, and he was using them to forge a gate beneath the Black Cathedral at the center of the ruined land. That gate would not open to a safe place. It would open the world to the void itself. And every person left in Black Hollow would be lost behind it. Kael first heard the truth from Mara, a young woman with silver hair, a torn green cloak, and sharp eyes that never stopped watching the road. She was a scout and messenger, and she had survived because she was quick, smart, and brave in the quiet way that mattered most. She found Kael in a burned watch station and told him that villages were disappearing one by one near the cathedral. She also told him that Thorn was not just gathering power out of cruelty. He wanted the crown because the old crown had once sealed the void sky shut during the First Demon War, and now the shattered crown pieces were the final lock on that ancient seal. Thorn believed that if he rebuilt the crown into a gate, he could invite the void into the world and rule whatever came through it. That was his motive, and it made terrible sense in the cold logic of evil. He did not want simple destruction. He wanted control over a new world born from ruin. Mara begged Kael to leave while there was still time, but Kael looked at the scarred horizon and knew there was no safe road left. The Null brand was made for this kind of battle, and he was the only one who could still carry it. So he set out with Mara beside him, not because he hoped to win, but because he refused to let fear choose for him. Their path crossed the field of broken spears, where old battle standards lay in the mud and black crows watched from dead trees. There they met Ethan, a former knight with dark blonde hair, a broad build, and a red mark burned across his left arm. He had once served the crown with Kael, but the void had touched him in battle and turned him into one of Thorn's corrupted champions. Ethan still wore his old armor, but it was cracked and covered in dark crystal veins that moved like living veins under his skin. He wanted release, yet he also wanted to prove that he was still stronger than his shame. When he saw Kael, he did not plead or run. He challenged him in a ruined courtyard and raised a great blade that now carried demon fire in its edge. The clash that followed was hard and fast, with sparks flying in the ash wind and broken stones shifting under every step. Kael knew Ethan would never surrender while the corruption still ruled him, so he fought with care, using the Null brand to drain the dark power from each strike. But every time the relic burned hot in his hand, Kael felt a whisper inside his own head, a thin voice telling him to stop resisting and let the void in. He won the duel by forcing Ethan back into the dust, not by cutting him down, but by shattering the dark crystal that controlled his strength. Ethan fell to one knee, gasping, and for a moment the old man beneath the corruption returned. He warned Kael that the cathedral was already building the final gate and that Thorn had more servants waiting inside. Then Ethan collapsed in silence, not dead but spent and broken, while Kael and Mara moved on with heavier hearts. The deeper they traveled, the more the land changed. Rivers ran black with ash, bells rang in empty towns with no hands on the ropes, and the sky split wider every night as if something enormous was pressing from the other side. Kael began to notice how the Null brand responded to that change. The iron relic was meant to neutralize demon power, but it was also feeding on the void, and that made it stronger and more dangerous at the same time. His fingers started to go cold after each use, and strange thoughts came easier than they should. For one long moment in a ruined chapel, Kael even saw himself wearing Thorn's crown and standing in the void sky like a king of nothing. He shook the vision away, but Mara saw the change in his face, and she knew the relic was winning ground inside him. She wanted him to throw it away before it consumed him, yet Kael refused because he understood the cruel truth now. If he let go, the demons would rise faster than the remaining soldiers could fight them. If he kept holding it, the relic would slowly turn him into the same kind of monster he hated. That was the heart of the conflict, and it made every mile heavier. Still, Kael pressed forward because the last town between him and the cathedral had already gone quiet, and its surviving people were hiding in the cellars beneath a collapsed school. There he found children, old farmers, and tired guards who had chosen to trust him with their lives. Their fear gave him strength, but it also gave him something worse, because now he had people to lose if he failed. At last, Kael and Mara reached the cathedral of black steel and ash, and the sight stole even Kael light. Tall iron ribs rose into the void like the bones of some giant beast, and melted statues watched from the walls with empty faces. Inside, Thorn stood before the forming gate, a demon lord with pale gray skin, black hair like burned rope, and a long crown frame of broken gold floating above his head. His eyes held no mercy, but his voice was calm, almost kind, as if he truly believed the world would be better under his rule. He told Kael that the crown had always been a lie because kings used it to keep the realm weak and afraid. In his view, the void was not a curse, but the only honest truth left in a broken age. Then he revealed the sharpest twist of all. The first oath-bound knights, including Kael's own mentor, had not only hidden the crown pieces. They had also bound part of the void seal into Kael's bloodline, which meant Kael was not merely the relic bearer. He was part of the lock itself. That was why the null brand answered him, and that was why the corruption spread so quickly in him. Thorn had known this for a long time, and he had allowed Kael to come all the way here because the final gate could not open without the last oath blood standing near it. Mara stared in shock, and Kael finally understood why his life had always felt like a road someone else had drawn. For the first time, he was no longer only a soldier following duty. He was a key, a target, and a choice. The cathedral shook as the gate began to rise, built from crown shards, chain links, and black fire. Thorn spread his hands, and waves of demon force slammed through the hall, forcing Mara back behind a broken altar. Kael stepped forward, lifted the null brand, and felt the relic throb like a second heart in his palm. The whispers in his mind grew louder, promising power, silence, and relief if he would only stop fighting. For one terrible breath, he almost gave in. He almost let the relic empty him and make him into something cold enough to end the battle without pain. But then he saw Mara, wounded but still standing, and he remembered the children in the cellar, the guards at the school, and Ethan kneeling in the ash with one last warning. Kael understood then that humanity was not weakness. It was the reason the fight mattered. He drove the null brand into the floor, and iron light spread through the cathedral in a hard circle, shutting down Thorn's demon force and cracking the half-built gate. Thorn roared and struck back, and the final clash shook the black steel walls so hard that ash poured from the ceiling like storm rain. Kael fought with everything he had, using skill, will, and the relic together, while Mara climbed the side rail and cut free the hanging crown chains that fed the gate. The cathedral groaned, the void screamed, and the broken crown began to split again. Kael did not know yet whether he would survive the price of what he was doing, and the truth of that choice hung over him like a blade. But even with the darkness pressing in, he kept moving, because the last knight of Black Hollow was no longer fighting just for duty. He was fighting for every fragile life still hiding in the ash, and the battle had only just reached its most dangerous point. The black steel cathedral trembled like a living beast, and every iron rib in its ceiling shivered under the force of the gate. Ash drifted through the broken arches in slow gray streams, while the last lights of Black Hollow flickered across melted statues and hanging chains. Kael stood in the center of it all, his blackened steel armor coated with dust, his dark red cloak torn at the edge, and the null brand held tight in both gauntleted hands. He was a man with tired blue eyes and a serious face, but he was also the last shield between the hidden survivors and the ruin around them. Mara stayed close behind him, a woman with silver hair, a torn green cloak, and sharp eyes that never stopped watching the shadows. She wanted to guide the people still alive to safety, and she mattered because she saw danger before most people even knew it was there. Far above them, Thorn watched with calm, cold eyes beneath the broken golden crown frame floating over his head. He was a man with black hair, pale gray skin, and layered black armor under a long, shadowed robe, and he wanted the gate open because he believed the void would remake the world into something strict, silent, and obedient. In his mind, freedom was only another word for weakness. That belief had brought the kingdom to this edge, and if the gate finished opening, Black Hollow would become a doorway instead of a home. Kael understood that now, and the truth settled on his shoulders with a weight heavier than any armor. The broken crown pieces still spun inside the gate like hot fragments trapped in a storm, and each one pulsed with faint void energy. They were not just royal relics anymore. They were the final parts of Thorn's machine, and the cathedral itself had become the lock that held the horror in place. Kael had fed the gate once already with the null brand, and the blade had answered by shining dull silver light that pushed back the demon power for a brief moment. Yet the cost had not ended, because the ancient relic did not destroy corruption so much as force it to retreat, and every use made the ground beneath them groan harder. Mara saw the pain in Kael's face, and she knew he was close to the edge, but she also knew he would never step away while lives were still trapped in the ash. "There are people in the lower halls," she said, her voice low and firm because she had counted them before the battle began. "If the gate bursts open, they will have no way out." Kael nodded once because he did not need more words. He had made his choice in that instant. Saving the cathedral alone meant nothing if the people inside were lost. Above them, Thorn raised one hand, and the shadows gathered around his fingers as if they were waiting to obey. His voice carried through the broken hall with smooth certainty. "You still think this is a rescue, Kael? You still think the old world deserves to remain? I am giving this place a future." He did not shout. He did not need to. He believed every word. That belief made him more dangerous than anger ever could. A heavy sound rolled through the cathedral, and Ethan stepped out from the smoke. He was a man with dark blonde hair, cracked old knight armor, dark crystal veins across his chest, and a red burn mark on his left arm. His build was strong, but his troubled face showed the strain of a mind that no longer trusted itself. He looked like a champion who had been broken and rebuilt by something cruel. Ethan had once defended Black Hollow beside Kael, and now he stood with his sword lowered, as if he could not decide whether he was an ally or a threat. The dark crystal veins across his armor glowed faintly, and Kael understood at once that Thorn had kept him close for a reason. Ethan was not there by accident. He was there because the corrupted power inside him could help stabilize the gate while also tearing his own judgment apart. That was the hidden truth. Thorn had not simply turned Ethan into a weapon. He had used Ethan as a living support beam for the gate, because a mind filled with guilt would obey longer than a mind filled with pride. When Mara saw Ethan, her eyes widened with shock because she had believed he was lost far beyond reach. Kael took one careful step forward, and he spoke in a steady voice that cut through the trembling air. "Ethan, look at me. You are still here. Do not let him decide what you are." Ethan flinched, and for one brief moment the fight in his face changed. The man inside the armor was still there, buried under pain and fear, and that single moment gave Kael hope. Thorn saw it too, and his cold smile sharpened. He lifted the broken crown frame higher, and the cathedral answered with a deep, ugly pulse. The floor split along old iron seams, and black light spilled upward in twisting lines. The lower halls below the cathedral shook as if something huge were waking beneath them. Mara turned fast, shouting for the hidden survivors to stay down, while Kael ran toward the center of the surge. He could feel the null brand growing cold in his hands, as if the relic itself feared what came next. Thorn began speaking in a low voice, and the words were less like a speech and more like a command forced into the bones of the room. He explained his motive at last, and the truth was worse than simple hunger for power. Long ago he had watched kingdoms rise and fall through greed, fear, and betrayal. He had decided that free people always chose chaos, and that chaos always led to suffering. The void in his twisted mind offered something clean. It did not argue, it did not forgive. It only erased choice and replaced it with perfect order. Thorn believed that if the gate fully opens, the world would not end, it would be corrected. That was why he had hunted the crown fragments, why he had broken the cathedral into a ritual chamber, and why he had fed the gate with every fear he could gather. Kael heard all of it, and instead of understanding Thorn, he understood how dangerous certainty could become when it forgot mercy. Then Ethan moved. His body shook, the crystal veins on his chest flaring bright, and he raised his sword toward Kael with a face full of pain. Mara gasped because the choice in front of Ethan was tearing him apart. He was being pulled by the gate and by Thorn, yet some part of him still wanted to resist. Kael did not attack. He set his feet, held the null brand out in front of him, and waited. The dull silver light spread across the blade, and the corruption in Ethan's armor faltered for one breath. That tiny pause was enough for Ethan to see Kael clearly, not as an enemy, but as the last person still asking him to come back. The revelation came in that pause, sharp and clean. Ethan was not fully under Thorn because he had failed. He was trapped because he had tried to protect the survivors before anyone else knew they were in danger. Thorn had blamed him for the collapse of the Western Wall, but in truth, Ethan had sealed the breach with his own body long enough for families to escape into the lower crypts. That act had left the red burn mark on his arm and let the dark crystal roots spread through his armor. Thorn had used that sacrifice as a chain, twisting Ethan's guilt until he believed he deserved the corruption. Kael saw it now, and the truth made his chest burn with anger. Thorn did not just rule by force. He ruled by making good people doubt the value of what they had done. Kael took one step toward Ethan, then another, even as the floor continued to shake. "You protected them," Kael said, his voice strong enough to carry through the storm. "You did the right thing." Ethan's eyes widened because no one had said those words to him since the battle began. Thorn's calm expression finally cracked, and for the first time, real irritation crossed his face. He lifted both hands and the crown pieces spun faster, feeding the gate with a violent surge. The cathedral groaned harder and the void screamed through the cracks like a wound trying to open wider. Mara threw a rope line toward a side arch, guiding frightened survivors toward a narrow stairwell, and she never looked away from the danger. She mattered in that moment because courage was not only fighting. It was keeping others moving when fear said to stop. Kael saw her work, saw Ethan wavering, and knew the next choice would decide whether Black Hollow became a graveyard of shadows or a place that could still be saved. Then Kael did the one thing Thorn did not expect. He stopped fighting the gate as if it were only an enemy, and instead he listened to it. The null brand had taught him enough to sense the shape of the corruption, and he realized the gate was not being held together by power alone. It was being held together by Thorn, Ethan, and the broken crown pieces all feeding the same wound. Remove one piece too soon and the whole chamber would collapse inward. Push too hard and the void would break loose. Kael understood that he needed balance, not blind force. He turned to Ethan and shouted over the roar, telling him to look at the crown frame above Thorn because it was not complete. It needed a final bond, and that bond was Ethan himself. Thorn had hidden that fact because it meant Ethan was never meant to survive the opening. He was only meant to anchor it. Ethan froze, and the meaning of the lie struck him hard. His troubled face twisted with shock, then with rage, because he had been used as a tool for a future he never chose. The dark crystal veins across his armor surged, but this time the surge came from his own will. He lowered his sword, then drove it into the stone floor, not to attack Kael, but to steady himself against Thorn's control. "I am done," Ethan said, and the words came out raw and shaking, yet they were his own. Thorn's eyes narrowed and the calm mask slipped away at last. He reached down through the floating crown frame, and a wave of shadow shot toward Ethan like a leash made of night. Kael stepped in front at once, the null brand blazing brighter than before, and the silver light clashed against the dark wave in a burst that threw sparks across the broken floor. Mara cried out for them to hold on, while the hidden survivors below the cathedral kept climbing into the narrow stairwell. The battle was no longer about winning fast. It was about holding long enough for every life to escape. The clash ended in a sudden, tense stillness, and in that stillness Kael felt the cost closing around him again. His arms shook from holding the null brand, his breathing grew heavy, and the cathedral lights dimmed and flared as if the whole structure was deciding whether to fall apart. Thorn had not been beaten. He had only been delayed, and his cold gaze promised that he would not forgive this setback. Yet something had changed inside the room. Ethan had chosen himself, Mara had kept the people moving, and Kael had learned that the gate could be resisted through trust instead of fear. That was the beginning of his change. He was no longer only a knight following duty. He was becoming the one person in Black Hollow willing to carry hope when hope itself felt too weak to matter. Thorn stepped back into the shadows beneath the broken crown frame, his robe dragging across the ash, and he spoke with quiet hatred. "You cannot save them all." Kael heard the threat, but he did not answer it with fear. He looked toward the stairwell where the last survivors were still climbing, then back to Ethan, whose face was pale but steadying. Mara reached Kael's side, her silver hair dusted with ash, and she placed one gloved hand on his arm for a brief moment. It was a small gesture, but it meant trust. Together they stood under the groaning cathedral, with the void still screaming above them and the broken crown still spinning in pieces. The gate had not opened fully yet, and the fight was far from over, but now Kael knew the truth of the battle ahead. Thorn was not simply trying to destroy Black Hollow, he was trying to replace choice with silence. Kael tightened his grip on the null brand, gathered his strength, and prepared to face the next move, because the night inside the cathedral was only getting darker, and the final answer had not yet been spoken. The black steel cathedral stood like a wound made of iron, with tall ribs of dark metal rising into a ceiling that vanished in smoke and shadow. Ash drifted through the broken air, and the last light of the ruined kingdom of Black Hollow leaked through cracks in the walls like a fading memory. Above the high arches, the gate kept groaning as if it was trying to become real, and the broken crown pieces kept circling in slow circles, each one glowing with weak void light. Kael stood under that awful sky of metal and dust, his blackened armor marked by ash, his dark red cloak torn at the edge, and his tired blue eyes fixed on the danger ahead. Mara stayed close at his side, a silver-haired scout in a torn green cloak with dark gloves and a cautious stance that never hid her courage. Thorn waded deeper inside the cathedral, calm as winter, with black hair, cold gray skin, and that broken golden crown frame floating above his head like a promise of control. He did not want Black Hollow to crumble by accident. He wanted every voice in it to stop choosing, because a silent kingdom could never resist him. That was the real horror in the room, and Kael understood it now. If Thorn won, the people of Black Hollow would not just lose a battle, they would lose the right to decide their own lives. Kael tightened his heavy iron gauntlets around the null brand, the ancient iron relic that still gave off a dull silver glow when it touched dark power. The blade felt cold and warped in his hands, as if it had been forged to fight something that should never exist. Mara looked up at the broken crown pieces and then at the gate, and her sharp eyes tracked every movement with fast, careful thought. She knew the crown was not just a symbol anymore. It was a key, a tool, and a trap all at once. Thorn had gathered the crown shards from the ruined throne room below the cathedral, and each piece held enough void energy to keep the gate open just long enough for his plan to finish. Ethan stood near the center of the chamber, broad shoulders tense inside cracked old knight armor, dark crystal veins running across his chest, and a red burn mark showing on his left arm like a sign of a battle he never finished. He had once been a guardian of the kingdom, and now he was a corrupted champion forced to carry Thorn power through his own pain. His face was troubled, not cruel, and that mattered because Kael could still see the man inside the damage. Mara saw it too. That was why she did not strike first. She wanted to know if Ethan could still be pulled back before the dark inside him became final. Thorn raised one hand and the crown pieces answered him at once, spinning faster above the broken floor. The gate in the air shuddered and a deep voice rose from it, not from any mouth Kael could see, but from the hollow space behind the world. Thorn spoke with perfect calm, and his words cut through the cathedral with terrible clarity. He said Black Hollow had already failed, because a kingdom built on choice always fell apart. People chose fear, pride, greed, and war, and the result was ruin after ruin. He said silence was not cruelty, but mercy, because a quiet world would never argue, never rebel, and never suffer from its own freedom. Kael felt anger rise hot in his chest, but he also felt something worse than anger. He felt the weight of a question. Thorn did not believe he was evil. He believed he was fixing the world by removing the thing that made people human. That made him more dangerous because he would never stop on his own. Mara cursed under her breath and shifted her grip on her blade, while Kael stepped forward through a drift of ash, ready to answer with steel if words failed. Then the cathedral floor trembled, and one of the crown fragments dropped into Ethan's palms, as if the corrupted champion had been waiting for a command all along. Ethan froze, and for one hard breath, everyone in the cathedral saw the same thing. He was not acting by choice. The dark crystal veins on his chest brightened and his jaw tightened as if he was fighting for control from the inside. Kael realized the deeper truth at the same moment Mara did. Thorn had not only corrupted Ethan with power, he had tied Ethan's will to the crown itself, using the broken royal relic as a leash. The crown had once belonged to the rulers of Black Hollow, but Thorn had twisted it into a tool of obedience. Anyone touched by its void energy could be pushed, bent, and forced to serve his silence. That was why the gate had to stay unstable, and that was why the crown pieces kept spinning instead of falling. The shards were not just building a door, they were building a system where every choice ended in Thorn's hands. Ethan shook, then lifted his head with a painful, determined stare. He looked at Kael, and inside that damaged look was a plea for help. He wanted to break free, but he could not do it alone. Mara saw the same plea, and her expression softened for one brief moment before hardening again with resolve. She moved first, sprinting along a broken line of iron benches and swinging a hooked blade at the floating crown pieces, trying to knock them out of Thorn control. Thorn barely turned his head. A wave of shadow slammed out from his robe, and Mara was forced back across the ash-covered floor, landing hard but staying awake. Kael rushed in before Thorn could follow with another strike, and the null brand flashed silver as it struck against the dark wall of power around the crown. The clash sent a sharp ring through the cathedral, and for a moment the whole room lit in broken silver light. The null brand did what it always did. It did not destroy dark power, it denied it. The void around the crown pieces flickered, and the gate shuddered as if it had been starved for a breath. Thorn finally showed a small crack in his calm, though it was only in his eyes. He had expected resistance, but not this kind. Kael used that opening to step closer to Ethan because the corrupted champion was now on one knee, one hand pressed to the cracked armor at his chest. Kael did not treat him like a monster. He spoke to him like a man who was still there. He told Ethan that the fight was not over and that the choice was still his, no matter how badly Thorn tried to hide it. Mara, now back on her feet, threw a length of chain around one crown shard and yanked hard, dragging it away from the center. The shard skidded across the floor, and the gate above them flickered weakly. Thorn lifted both hands, and his cold voice sharpened for the first time. He said choice was a weakness that had destroyed the kingdom, and he would not let it poison the world again. Then he turned to Ethan and gave the command to finish Kael. Ethan rose slowly, trembling with pain and fury, caught between orders and his own will. The room went still because everyone knew this was the moment where the next answer would be made. Kael held the null brand low, ready to block, but he did not move to strike first. He watched Ethan's eyes, not his armor, and he saw the truth buried under the corruption. Ethan was not Thorn's servant by nature. He was a man trapped by a power built to erase his voice. Kael stepped closer anyway, trusting that one honest word might matter more than force. He told Ethan that silence was not peace and obedience was not safety. He said Black Hollow had already lost enough to fear, and it did not need one more puppet to fall in line. The words hit harder than any blade because Ethan's body began to shake with clear resistance. The dark crystal veins across his chest pulsed, then dimmed for one stolen second. Mara understood the opening and moved with perfect timing, hurling the last chain from the floor across the crown fragments and tangling two of them together. The broken crown jerked sideways and the gate let out a deep, angry sound. Thorn turned his head toward her with open anger now, no longer calm, because his perfect plan had begun to break. Then the cathedral answered with another shock, and a hidden panel near the altar slid open under the pressure of the shifting gate. Inside was a narrow stairway going down into darkness, and a blast of cold air rose from it, carrying a second voice, faint and ancient, as if something below had been waiting to be found. Kael stared at the stairs and then at Thorn, and in that instant he understood the final twist of the night. Thorn had not made the crown alone. Someone, long before this battle, had built the lower chamber to hold something worse than the gate itself. Mara looked down the stairway with wide eyes, and Ethan staggered as if the sound below had reached him through the corruption. Thorn smiled at last, and that smile held the first real fear Kael had seen from him, because the hidden chamber was not part of his plan. It was part of an older one, and whatever waited below, still unseen and still calling through the dark, was now waking up as the gate began to slip out of control. The air inside the black steel cathedral felt thin and cold, like it had been burned clean of all warmth. Black iron ribs rose overhead in high arches, and ash drifted across the floor in slow gray sheets. Broken statues leaned from the walls with melted faces, while heavy chains hung still and dark above the chamber. Kael stood at the edge of the stairway, his blackened steel armor scraped with ash, his dark red cloak hanging behind him like a torn banner. In his heavy gauntlets he held the null brand, and the relic gave a dull silver pulse that answered the strange pull from below. Mara stood close beside him, a woman with silver hair, a torn green cloak, and sharp eyes that never stopped moving. Ethan was one step behind them, a strong man with dark blonde hair, cracked old knight armor, and dark crystal veins spreading across his chest like a warning. Thorn watched from the far side of the chamber, a man with black hair, pale gray skin, and a broken golden crown frame floating above his head. He wore a long shadowed robe over black armor plates, and his cold eyes now held something rare. Fear. The hidden chamber below was not part of his plan, and that made it dangerous for everyone. Kael understood the truth at once. The gate was no longer the only threat. Something older was waking beneath it, and if it broke free, the last safe parts of Black Hollow could fall into ruin forever. Thorn stepped back from the stairwell and raised one hand as if he could command the dark itself to stop moving. "You were never meant to find that room," he said, his voice calm but tight. "It was sealed before my line began. Before the crown broke, before the kingdom fell." Mara looked at him with open suspicion because she had already learned that Thorn never gave the full truth unless the truth could help him. She was a scout by nature, quick to notice what others missed, and she wanted one thing above all else now. She wanted enough truth to survive this place. Ethan clenched his jaw, and the red burn mark on his left arm flared faintly under the crystal veins in his armor. He wanted one thing too, though he barely understood it. He wanted the corruption in him to stop steering his body like a puppet. Kael moved his grip on the null brand and spoke with steady force. "Then tell us what is below." Thorn gave a thin smile that made the air feel worse. "A lock," he said, "and a hunger that was chained under the cathedral when Black Hollow was still whole. My family used the crown pieces to build a gate, but the room below was made by the first kings who feared what the crown could wake. They buried it here because no one else could hold it." That answer struck hard because it finally made sense. Thorn had not made the old chamber. He had only found it and tried to use it. That meant his plan had grown from greed, but it had also grown from fear. He wanted control because he believed control was the only thing that could save him from being destroyed by the same force he hoped to command. A deep sound rolled up the stairs then, low and wet and alive, and every chain in the cathedral began to tremble. The gate behind Thorn flickered with broken light, and the shattered crown pieces around its frame flashed in uneven bursts. Gold, silver, and black stone pieces spun in the air like they were being pulled by a giant hand. Ethan staggered and grabbed the railing with one gauntleted fist, his troubled face tightening as the corruption in him answered the sound from below. Mara reached for him at once, steadying his shoulder. She did not trust his altered armor, but she trusted the pain she saw in his eyes. "Stay with us," she said. "Do not listen to it." He nodded once, though it was clear he was fighting something deeper than fear. Kael looked down the stairway and saw only darkness at first, but the null brand warmed in his hands, and its dull silver glow formed a thin line along the steps. In that light, he noticed old marks carved into the stone walls. They were not demon runes, they were warning marks set in a pattern that repeated every few steps. Someone had tried to keep this place shut for a very long time. Then the floor below the stairs shuddered, and a crack of black light flashed through the cracks between the stones. Thorn's face tightened, and for the first time his cold control slipped. "No," he whispered, "it should still be asleep." That single word changed everything. The thing below was not a tool. It was a prisoner, and Thorn had woken it by mistake while trying to force the gate open. The crown pieces had acted like keys, but keys did not always open doors the way the holder wanted. Sometimes they opened the wrong thing. The chamber was no longer waiting, it was answering. Kael made the first real choice of the night. He stepped onto the stairs and led the way down, because if the unknown below had been sealed by older kings, then waiting would only give it more time to rise. Mara followed at once, her silver hair flashing in the broken light as she moved with careful speed. She wanted to map every turn and every weak point, because that was how she survived impossible places. Ethan came after them, still shaking but still refusing to run. He wanted to prove that the corruption in his chest did not own him, and each step was a fight he could not afford to lose. Thorn did not follow right away. Instead, he stared at the drifting crown frame above his head and clenched his hand as if he could force it back into order. He had built his whole life on the belief that power could be studied, shaped, and ruled. Now he faced a secret that had never cared about his plans. The stairway twisted deep under the cathedral, and the walls changed from black steel to old stone covered in frost-like ash. The air grew colder with every step, and the sound below changed too. It was no longer only a call. It was a pulse, slow and heavy, like a giant heart beating behind a sealed door. Mara found a carved panel on the wall and brushed ash from it with one dark glove. The carving showed a crown above a deep crack, and beneath it, small figures kneeling with their hands over their heads. "This was buried on purpose," she said. "Not to hide treasure, to hide fear." Kael heard her, and his tired blue eyes sharpened. He had entered the cathedral thinking he would fight a gate. Now he understood that the gate was only the surface of a much older wound. That truth made the mission harder, but it also gave him a new purpose. He was not only trying to stop Thorn, he was trying to keep a buried disaster from waking fully. They reached the lower chamber at last, and the sight stopped them all. The room was round and vast, supported by black stone pillars wrapped in iron bands. In the center stood a sealed pit covered by a ring of broken crown fragments, old chains, and symbols worn smooth by time. Black light leaked from the seams in slow breaths, and every breath made the floor tremble. Around the pit lay the remains of an ancient binding circle, but parts of it had already cracked open under Thorn's gatework above. On the far side of the room stood a stone panel with a faded seal, and Mara read the carved words aloud with a tense voice. "If the crown calls, the hollow answers." Ethan went still when he heard it. The corruption in his chest pulsed once, hard enough to make him bend at the waist. He suddenly understood why the dark call had reached him through the cathedral. His armor, his veins, and the strange burn on his arm were not just random damage. They were proof that the same force below had touched him before, and that touch had left a mark deep enough to hear. Kael turned toward Thorn, who had finally descended into the chamber with a look of sharp regret and stubborn hunger mixed together. "You knew this place could wake something worse," Kael said. Thorn lifted his chin. "I knew it could give me the power to rule what remains," he answered. "I knew the world already broke once. I wanted the peace that could make sure I was never left helpless again." It was not a lie, and that made it worse. Thorn had not sought power only to conquer. He had sought it because he could not bear being weak in a ruined world. The problem was that his fear had made him reckless. He had opened a prison and called it a throne. Then the sealed pit opened a little wider, and all of them heard a voice from below, deep and patient, speaking through the black light like it had always been there. It did not shout. It did not rage. It simply welcomed. The sound pushed into Kael like cold water, and for one dangerous moment he felt the same old pull that had tried to bend the cathedral since the first crown piece was found. Mara pressed a hand to the wall and forced herself to stay upright. She wanted to run, but she refused to leave Kael standing alone. Ethan lifted his cracked sword arm, and the dark crystal veins across his chest flared as if something inside him wanted to answer the voice. Kael saw it all at once. The chamber below was not a demon lord waiting to rise in one clean form. It was a deeper hollow, an ancient force that fed on broken will, fear, and control. That was why the crown pieces mattered. They were not just parts of a royal relic. They were anchors, and when Thorn used them to forge the gate, he had tied the old prison to the new one. Now both locks were failing together. Kael raised the null brand, and the silver glow along its blade grew brighter. The relic did not like the void below, but it could resist it for a moment. Thorn saw the light and took one step forward, angry now, no longer calm. "If you break the seal," he said, "you may crack the whole cathedral." Kael looked at him with tired certainty. "And if we do nothing, the whole kingdom may be lost." That was the real choice now. Break the seal and risk a collapse, or let the ancient force rise and spread. The chamber trembled harder, the crown pieces shook in their ring, and the black light climbed higher from the pit. Mara moved beside Kael and drew a small blade from her belt, not because she believed steel could solve the problem, but because she would not stand empty-handed in the dark. Ethan straightened with visible effort, his face tight with pain and resolve, and his corrupted armor gave one rough pulse like a warning. Thorn stared into the opening below, and for the first time his confidence looked thin. Whatever waited in the hollow had begun to remember him. Kael felt that memory too, like a hand brushing the edge of his mind, and he knew the next step would decide far more than one battle. It would decide whether the old prison stayed shut, or whether the nightmare below the cathedral would finally find its way into Black Hollow. The black steel cathedral stood in a dead hush, with cold iron ribs rising into a split sky of ash and void light. Broken statues leaned in every hall, and heavy chains hung from the arches like warnings left by old hands. Below that silent height, the opening in the floor breathed out a thin gray wind, and everyone near it felt the same thing at once. Something ancient was awake again, and it was not sure whether it wanted to escape or remember. Kael stood at the edge of the opening with his blackened steel armor dusted in ash, his dark red cloak hanging stiff behind him, and the null brand resting in his iron gauntlet. Mara stayed close beside him, her silver hair tied back under a torn green cloak, her sharp eyes moving over every shadow like she expected one to jump. Ethan stood a few paces away, his dark blonde hair falling across a troubled face, his cracked armor carrying dark crystal veins over his chest, while the red burn mark on his left arm pulsed like it still hurt from a fire he had never fully left. And above them all, Thorn watched with pale gray skin, cold eyes, and a broken golden crown frame floating over his head like a cruel joke made real. He had come here for one reason, and that reason was now clear to everyone. He wanted to open the old prison below the cathedral because he believed the force inside could bend the broken kingdom of Black Hollow back under his rule. He did not care if the world above was ruined in the process. He only cared that the power below would answer to him. That was the heart of the danger. If Thorn succeeded, the Hollow would not stay buried, and the nightmare under the cathedral would spill into the roads, towers, and broken homes of Black Hollow. Kael understood that now with terrible clarity, and the weight of that truth sat on his chest like iron. The warning pulse from the corrupted armor had not been random. It had been a reaction, as if the old prison recognized Thorn and disliked what he had become. Thorn noticed the change in Kael, and for the first time his calm smile looked thin. He turned his head slowly toward the dark opening and spoke in a low, even voice, telling them that the Hollow did not belong to the weak. He said the crown was broken, the kingdom was broken, and only the power below could make anything whole again. Mara answered him with a hard stare and told him that a thing built from ruin would only ruin more. Ethan said nothing at first, but his jaw tightened because he knew the truth more than anyone there. He had once served as Thorn's champion, and the dark crystal veins across his chest were proof of what that service had cost him. Kael looked at Ethan and saw the struggle inside him. He wanted freedom, but part of him still feared the commands that lived in his blood and bone. That made Ethan dangerous, but it also made him important. He knew the ways Thorn spoke, the lies he used, and the steps he had taken to forge this prison into a gate. Thorn lifted one hand, and the shattered crown pieces hidden in the shadows of the cathedral floor stirred with faint void energy. They had not simply been broken by accident. Thorn had gathered them from the old royal vaults because the crown had once been made to seal the Hollow, and he had learned that its fragments could now do the opposite. He planned to use the broken crown to shape the prison into a doorway. That was the cruel logic of his scheme. What was made to lock the nightmare away could be forced to call it home again. Kael felt that truth land in him like a blow, and he realized the old kingdom had not merely fallen. It had been stripped apart piece by someone who understood how to use its own wounds against it. Then the cathedral shook. A deep sound rolled up from below, not a roar, not a scream, but a memory waking inside stone. The floor around the opening flashed with dull silver light, and the null brand answered with a cold glow of its own. Kael gripped the relic blade harder, and for one brief instant he saw a shape in the dark below, as if a vast face had turned upward to look at him. The shape was not clear, but the feeling was. It knew him, or at least it knew the burden he carried. Mara saw his expression change, and she moved closer without speaking, giving him the kind of steady support that asked for nothing. Thorn also saw the reaction, and his eyes sharpened with greedy interest. He had expected fear, but he was seeing recognition instead. That difference mattered. If the prison remembered Kael, then the relic in his hand might not only hold back the Hollow. It might also be a key to controlling what remained asleep. Thorn wanted that power, and now he wanted Kael more than before. He took one slow step forward, and his voice turned almost gentle as he told Kael that every seal could be opened, every wall could be turned, and every guard could be made useful. He said that the Hollow below had no master yet, but it could have one. Kael felt anger rise, yet he did not rush in. He had learned that Thorn fed on reckless attacks, so he did the one thing Thorn did not expect. He listened. In the next moment, the cathedral answered with another pulse, and the broken crown pieces began to rise from the floor in a loose ring around the opening. Dark light ran between them like veins. Thorn spread his hands, and the air grew heavy. Mara drew her dark gloves tighter and reached for the small throwing blades at her belt, but Kael raised one gauntlet and stopped her. He had seen enough to know that force alone would not solve this. The Hollow was trying to open, and the memory inside it was growing stronger with every pulse. Then Ethan stepped forward, his face twisted with pain and resolve. He told Kael that Thorn had taught him how the crown pieces worked, and that the opening below was not a simple hole. It was a sealed memory chamber, built long ago to trap whatever had first crawled out of the void. The people of Black Hollow had not only hidden a monster, they had also hidden the names, faces, and failures of the ones who let it through the first time. Ethan revealed that Thorn had used those lost memories as fuel because forgotten fear made the gate easier to feed. That was the real reason he needed the cathedral. He did not just want power. He wanted the old fear of the kingdom itself, because fear made people obey and obedience made openings stay open. Kael absorbed the truth in silence. The main conflict was clearer now than ever. They were not fighting for one room or one fight. They were fighting over memory, because memory was the lock and Thorn was trying to break it. The sudden revelation changed everything. Ethan was not just a corrupted champion. He was also a witness. He had seen the early work of the gate and had helped build the path by mistake, because he believed Thorn would use the power to protect the ruined people of Black Hollow. Instead, Thorn had turned that hope into a weapon. Ethan lowered his head and admitted that he had been wrong. The words were hard, but they were true, and they mattered. Kael did not forgive him yet, but he saw the sincerity there. Then the floor split with another heavy pulse, and a thin, dark current climbed the cathedral wall like smoke trying to become a hand. Thorn smiled at that sight, because his plan was close to success. He lifted the broken crown frame over his head, and the crown pieces answered him at once. Mara moved first, darting forward through the ashlight and cutting one chain loose so it swung into the rising dark current. The impact broke the flow for a second, just long enough for Kael to drive the null brand into the stone at the lip of the opening. The iron relic flared with dull silver light, and the spreading void energy shuddered back. The cathedral groaned under the strain. Thorn staggered half a step, and the thin confidence that had once filled his face finally cracked. He had not expected the relic to push back so hard. He had believed the hollow would welcome him. Instead, it had begun to reject him even as it remembered him. That made him dangerous in a new way, because a cornered Thorn would stop pretending and start breaking everything within reach. He snarled that Kael could not seal what was already his. Kael answered by pulling the null brand free and taking one hard breath. He felt the old prison beneath the cathedral not as a place but as a wound in the world. He felt its fear, its duty, and its long refusal to open. He also felt his own fear, and for the first time he did not try to hide it. He understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to stand in front of it anyway. Mara saw that change in him, and her expression softened for a moment, because she knew he had crossed a line inside himself. Ethan saw it too, and that sight gave him a strange new steadiness. He stepped beside Kael, lifting his cracked armored arm, and said that if the Hollow wanted to remember the past, then they would make it remember the truth. Thorn laughed once, but the sound held no real confidence now. It was sharp, angry, and thin, the sound of someone who had just found out the world was not obeying him as it should. The chapter ended there, with the cathedral trembling above the hidden prison, the broken crown still turning in the dark air, and the opening below widening by a hair. Kael stood ready with the null brand glowing low in his hand. Mara held her ground in the shadows, and Ethan faced the gate with a face full of regret and resolve. Thorn was not beaten, but his control was slipping, and the memory below had become a living force that no one fully understood. Whatever came next would decide whether the prison stayed shut or broke apart forever. And as the ash wind rose through the black steel cathedral, all three of them knew that the next step would change Black Hollow for good. The black steel cathedral stood in silence for one last breath, and then even that silence began to shake. Ash drifted through the black arches like falling snow, and the broken chains above them trembled as if the whole building feared what was waking below. Kael stood near the gate with the null brand in both hands, his black hair damp with sweat, his tired blue eyes fixed on the cracked floor. He wore blackened steel armor with ash on the shoulders, a dark red cloak and heavy iron gauntlets, and every line of his serious face showed how much he had already lost to reach this place. Mara stayed back in the shadows, her silver hair hidden under a torn green cloak, her lean scout body still and ready, her sharp eyes watching every move. Ethan stood between them and the gate, a strong man in cracked old knight armor, dark blonde hair falling across a troubled face, dark crystal veins shining across his chest, and a red burn mark on his left arm that pulsed whenever the corruption inside him stirred. Above and beyond them all, Thorn waited in a long shadowed robe with black armor plates, pale gray skin, cold commanding eyes, and a broken golden crown frame floating over his head like a warning. He was calm, but calm in a way that made the air feel dangerous, because he did not want to save the prison below. He wanted it open, because he believed the world had already fallen too far to be repaired. The problem was simple, and that made it worse. If the seal below broke, the memory inside the prison would not stay asleep, and the force inside it could flood Black Hollow with old ruin and hungry power. Thorn knew that, and he wanted it anyway. He believed the prison was a lie built by weak rulers, and he believed the only way to rule the broken world was to pull that hidden power into the open and bend it to his will. The shattered crown pieces floating near the gate gave him the tool he needed, because they were made from gold, silver, and black stone, and each fragment still held a faint void glow. He had used them to force the cathedral into a half-open wound, and now the gate was answering him. Kael understood that if the prison failed, the last barrier between Black Hollow and the memory below would collapse, and everything left in the fallen kingdom would be swept into the same darkness. That was why Mara had not yet stepped out, why Ethan had not yet chosen a side, and why Kael kept the null brand ready even though its dull silver light was already fading. He knew the relic could neutralize demon power, but he also knew it had limits. If he used it too soon, he might lose the only chance to stop Thorn when the final moment came. Thorn turned his head toward Ethan first because he knew exactly where the weak point was. Ethan had once served as his champion, and even now he carried the shame of that loyalty like a wound that would not close. The dark crystal veins across Ethan's chest were not just a sign of corruption. They were a chain. Thorn had fed that corruption slowly, promising power, purpose, and relief from pain until Ethan no longer knew where his own will ended. But Ethan had begun to remember what he had been before that, and the memory made him tremble. He was not a monster, and he was not fully free. He was a man who wanted to make one honest choice before the end. Thorn saw the hesitation in him and smiled with thin, cold certainty. Then he raised one hand toward the crown pieces, and the broken fragments spun faster, pulling black light through the cracks in the floor. The gate gave a deep groan. Stones shifted. The cathedral answered with a low thunder that rolled through every broken statue and every iron chain. Mara felt the change at once, and she leaned forward from the shadows, waiting for the sign that would tell her whether to trust Kael, strike Thorn, or flee before the whole place fell apart. Kael moved first because waiting any longer would have meant surrender. He stepped forward with the null brand lifted chest high, and the relic brightened with a dull silver glow that cut a clean line through the dark air. The light touched the nearest crown fragment, and the black energy around it shivered and thinned. Thorn narrowed his eyes, surprised not by the relic itself, but by the fact that Kael still had enough will left to stand against him. Kael spoke without shouting, and his voice carried through the cathedral with a hard, steady force. He told Ethan that the choice was still his. He told Mara that the gate was not just a door, but a trap built around a living memory. He told Thorn that power taken from ruin would only make more ruin. Thorn answered with a quiet laugh and said that ruin was honest, while hope was only a pretty lie people told themselves before they broke. Then he spread his hands, and the crown frame above him flashed with a pale void pulse that slammed through the gate. The floor split wider. A wave of cold pressure surged up from below, and for one terrible moment, the hidden memory felt alive enough to look back. That was when the twist came, and it hit all three of them at once. The force below was not just a prison full of old fear. It was the memory of the kingdom itself, sealed away by the first rulers of Black Hollow, who had hidden the truth because they were afraid of what people would do if they knew what had really ended the war. The prison had not been made to hold a demon army, as Thorn claimed. It had been made to bury a promise. Long ago, the rulers had used the shattered crown to seal away a source of void power, but they had also sealed the names of everyone who had paid the price to make that choice. Thorn had learned this truth and twisted it for his own use. He did not simply want control. He wanted the buried power because it had once belonged to the bloodline he believed was stolen from him. In his mind, opening the gate would prove that the old rulers were liars and that only he had the strength to inherit the truth. The revelation shook Ethan hardest because it meant his corruption had been built on a lie. He had fought for Thorn under the belief that order was better than chaos, but now he saw that Thorn had always planned to sacrifice the kingdom for revenge against history itself. Mara watched the way Ethan stared at the gate, and she finally understood why he had never fully crossed over to Thorn. He had been fighting fear, not just loyalty. Ethan took one slow step forward, and the crystal veins in his chest lit with a dark pulse. His voice was rough when he spoke, but it was his own at last. He said he would not help Thorn break the prison. He said he had spent too long helping the wrong side because it felt easier than facing the truth. He said the corruption in him had fed on his guilt, and that guilt had kept him blind. Thorn did not rage. He only looked disappointed, which made him more dangerous. He lifted one hand and sent a burst of black force through Ethan, trying to drag him back under control. Ethan staggered, but he did not fall. Kael saw the moment clearly, and he knew this was the chance that could not be wasted. He drove the null brand into the floor between Ethan and the gate. The dull silver light spread in a circle, washing over the black lines in the stone and cutting the flow of void energy for a heartbeat. Mara used that heartbeat well. She leapt from the shadows, her boots striking the ash-covered floor with quick, light steps, and she threw a hooked line that wrapped around one of the spinning crown fragments. She pulled hard and the fragment jerked free, breaking the pattern Thorn needed to keep the gate stable. Thorn turned on her instantly, his eyes colder than before, and the cathedral seemed to lean toward his anger. But his control was slipping now, and everyone could feel it. The gate screamed without a mouth, and the sound rolled through the cathedral like iron tearing apart. The floor cracked wider, and a tall shape began to rise in the dark behind the veil, not fully formed, not fully seen, but powerful enough to make the air taste like ash and old storms. Kael knew the prison would not hold much longer if they kept fighting Thorn alone, so he changed his plan. He did not try to destroy the gate, he aimed to restore the seal. The null brand was a neutralizing relic, and if it touched the crown pieces in the right pattern, it could cancel the void pulse long enough to force the seal back into place. But that meant someone had to hold the line while the rest worked, and Ethan understood that before Kael even said it. Ethan looked at Mara, then at Kael, and the fear on his face finally gave way to something steadier. He would guard the broken ring around the gate. Mara would keep the crown fragments from returning to Thorn. Kael would use the null brand to silence the pulse below. It was a risky plan, and all of them knew it. Thorn knew it too, and for the first time, he lost the calm smile. He called them fools and said the old world had already chosen him. Then the cathedral shook as the force below pushed harder and the ash wind rose like a living thing. Kael planted his feet, Mara tightened her grip, and Ethan raised his cracked armor toward the darkness. They were not winning yet, but they were no longer breaking apart, and that was enough to keep the prison from falling in that moment. Above them, the broken crown spun out of balance. The gate throbbed with unstable light, and Thorn stepped back into the shadows with a look that promised he was preparing something far worse. The next move would decide whether Black Hollow would be saved, or whether the buried memory would rise at last. The black steel cathedral trembled like a wounded beast, and cold light kept flashing through its broken ribs of iron and stone. Ash drifted down from the high arches, and the air tasted of smoke, dust, and old magic. Kael stood near the shattered center floor, his blackened steel armor scratched and dull, his dark red cloak hanging heavy behind him. The null brand rested in both of his iron gauntlets, and its dull silver glow pulsed like a quiet warning. Mara stayed close to his left, silver hair tied back under her torn green cloak, her sharp eyes moving over every shadow. Ethan stood on Kael's right, his cracked armor shaking with dark crystal veins across his chest, while the red burn mark on his left arm glowed faintly under the unstable light. They were all tired, and all of them knew the same hard truth. If Thorn finished the ritual above them, Black Hollow would be lost, and the buried memory beneath the cathedral would rise into the world. That buried memory was the reason this battle mattered so much. Long before the cathedral became a prison, it had been built over a sealed chamber that held the last record of the kingdom's fall. The rulers of Black Hollow had hidden that memory because it named the true betrayal behind the ruin, and Thorn wanted it because it also revealed how the broken crown pieces could command the demon gate. He did not want power for its own sake alone. He wanted proof, control, and fear. If people learned the truth too early, they would panic, turn on each other, and hand him the broken kingdom without resistance. That was why he stepped back into the shadows now, calm and patient, while the gate above them throbbed with unstable light. His pale gray face was almost hidden, but the floating broken golden crown frame above his head still marked him clearly. He was not retreating because he was afraid. He was moving because he had planned this part in advance. Mara was the first to understand the danger. She had spent years surviving ruined roads, collapsed watchtowers, and ash farms, and she knew the signs of a trap before most people even noticed one. She had joined Kael because she wanted something simple and honest, a future that did not end in ash. She had also become the one person in the group who could still notice small details when fear tried to blind them. She pointed up at the crown pieces circling the gate, and her voice stayed low and clear. "He is not trying to force the gate open all at once," she said. "He is tuning it. He wants the memory chamber to answer the crown, not the other way around." Kael understood at once. The null brand could weaken demon power, but it could not close a gate that had already learned a name. Ethan lifted his cracked armor a little higher, and though his face stayed troubled, his voice came out steady. "Then we stop the name before it finishes," he said. Ethan had been a champion once, before corruption touched his armor and made him dangerous to his own side. He wanted redemption more than victory, and that desire made him brave enough to keep standing when his body wanted to fail. Then the shadows moved, and Thorn stepped forward again with a thin, cold smile. He was a tall man in layered black armor plates under a long, shadowed robe, and his black hair was slicked back from a face that never seemed to tire. He looked almost peaceful as he raised one hand toward the ceiling, but his cold eyes carried no mercy at all. "You still think this is a battle for a door," he said, his voice calm and clear. "It is a battle for memory, and memory decides who gets obeyed." The broken crown above him spun faster, and one piece of gold and black stone dropped toward the center of the gate, only to stop in the air as if held by invisible chains. A deep hum rolled through the cathedral floor, the walls shivered, the hanging iron chains swung against the arches. Kael felt the null brand grow colder, as if the relic itself was trying to warn him. He took one step forward, then another, because he knew hesitation would only feed Thorn more time. "You are hiding behind a lie," Kael called out. "You want the memory because you are scared of what it says." Thorn did not deny it. That silence was worse than any shout. The answer came from Ethan, who suddenly closed his eyes and staggered as if the cathedral itself had reached into his mind. The dark crystal veins in his chest flashed once, then spread across his cracked armor like branching frost. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was not on Thorn, it was on the broken crown pieces above the gate. "I remember this place," he said in a voice that sounded older than before. "I was here when they sealed it." Mara turned toward him in shock, and even Kael froze for a moment. Ethan had never spoken clearly about what had happened to him before the corruption, and now the truth came out in pieces, hard and sharp. He had once served as one of the cathedral guards when the last king ordered the memory chamber hidden. The sealing ritual had gone wrong because Thorn had been there already, wearing a servant mask and feeding false commands into the crowd. Thorn had not simply found Black Hollow after the fall, he had helped create the fall from inside it. That was the twist, clear and brutal, and it changed everything. The enemy was not a stranger attacking the ruins. He was the hand that had guided the ruin into place. The cathedral answered Ethan's memory with a violent pulse. A ring of dark light cracked outward from the gate, and the floor split in wide lines that did not open into fire or blood, but into black wind and whispering cold. Shadow shapes began to rise from the cracks, not fully formed, but strong enough to shove air from the room and force the heroes back. Mara pulled a throwing knife from her belt and hurled it through one of the shadow shapes, causing it to scatter into smoke. Kael swung the null brand in a wide arc, and the dull silver glow from the relic cut a clean path through another wave of darkness, neutralizing the force long enough for Ethan to brace himself. Ethan stepped forward against the pressure, his left arm shaking under the red burn mark, and he used his armored shoulder to block a surge of corrupt power that would have knocked Mara down. He was not fully clean, and he knew it. Still, he chose to stand between the darkness and his friends anyway. That choice mattered more than strength. Above them, Thorn spread his hands, and the broken crown pieces answered him like trained birds. 3 fragments drifted into a triangle, and the center of the gate glowed a deep violet that made the stained walls look like wet stone. "You cannot stop what the kingdom buried," he said. "The memory will rise, and when it does, the people will finally see that fear is safer than hope." He believed every word he said. That was what made him dangerous. He had spent so long in ruin and hunger that he no longer trusted anything gentle. He wanted a world that could never surprise him, even if it had to be chained to darkness to make that happen. Kael saw that, and for the first time he understood why Thorn had seemed so calm through every setback. Thorn was not fighting for a throne made of gold. He was trying to build a world where nothing could be hidden from him again, even if that world became a prison. Mara moved fast along the broken edge of the floor, scanning the floating crown pieces and the lines of power between them. She found the pattern first, because she always did. "The crown is using the memory chamber as an anchor," she shouted. "If we break the pattern, the gate loses shape." Kael did not waste a second. He drove the null brand down into a crack in the floor, and the relic flashed brighter than before. The silver light did not burn the shadows, but it stripped away their strength and made them thin. Ethan understood the opening at once. With a strained breath, he slammed both gauntlets together and released a shock through his damaged armor, sending a rippling force through the chamber. It was not clean power, but it was enough to jar one of the floating crown pieces out of line. The broken fragment spun wildly and struck a wall with a sharp crack. The gate shuddered hard. For one heartbeat, hope entered the room like a blade of light. Thorn reacted at once. His expression did not turn angry. It turned colder. He lifted one hand and the remaining crown pieces began to pull together above his head, gathering around the broken frame like hungry sparks. The darkness behind him thickened, and a deeper voice seemed to answer from inside the gate, slow and vast and still not fully awake. Kael felt the floor dip beneath him as if the cathedral itself were about to bow to that voice. Mara grabbed Kael by the arm before he could rush forward too far, and her grip was firm. "Not yet," she said. "He wants you to charge in blind." Kael forced himself to listen. Ethan was breathing hard, but he was still standing. The three of them had not won, but they had stopped the collapse for one more moment, and that moment was enough to change the shape of the fight. Then from deep under the cathedral floor there came a new sound, soft at first and then clear. It was not the gate. It was a human voice speaking from the sealed chamber below. The voice said a name none of them expected, and all three of them turned at once toward the broken stone, because the next answer had just begun to wake. Below the floor, something had heard them back, and the buried memory was no longer sleeping. The black steel cathedral trembled like a giant beast in pain, and the broken arches cast long shadows across the ash-covered floor. Chains hung from the high ribs of black metal, and melted statues watched in silence as gray dust drifted through the cold air. Kael stood near the shattered stone at the center of it all, his blackened steel armor marked with ash, his dark red cloak hanging heavy behind him, and the null brand resting in his iron gauntlets with a dull silver glow. Beside him, Mara kept low and ready, her silver hair pulled back beneath a torn green cloak, her sharp eyes fixed on the floor, and her dark gloves tight around the hilt of her short blade. Across the broken chamber, Thorn remained calm in his long, shadowed robe, black armor plates hidden beneath it, the broken golden crown frame floating above his pale gray head like a promise of control. Ethan stood near him, strong and tense, his cracked old knight armor marked by dark crystal veins and a red burn mark across his left arm, and his troubled face showed a man split between obedience and regret. The danger was plain now. If the gate finished opening, Black Hollow would fall into deeper ruin, and if the buried chamber below held what Thorn wanted, then the last barrier between the living world and the void could be broken forever. Kael knew that stopping the gate was not enough anymore, because the truth below the floor was part of the same wound, and somebody had just answered from inside it. The voice rose again from the sealed chamber, low and rough, and then clear enough for every ear in the cathedral to hear. It said, "Ethan, if you are still yourself, do not let him finish the crown." The words hit the room like cold iron. Ethan went still, and for one hard moment even Thorn showed surprise, though his face quickly returned to a calm and cruel stare. Mara looked from Ethan to Kael, understanding at once that this was no trick made for fear alone. Someone below knew Ethan, and that meant the buried chamber was not empty, not forgotten, and not safe to ignore. Kael tightened his grip on the null brand because he understood the shape of the problem more clearly now. The cathedral had not only been built as a shrine, it had been built to hide a prison. The shattered crown pieces were not simply tools for Thorn's plan, they were parts of the lock itself, and the lock had just begun to break. Thorn had wanted the crown because it could command the gate, but the voice below suggested something worse. The crown could also wake what had been forced to sleep under the stone. Thorn lifted one hand, and the broken crown frame above him turned slowly, drawing in the void glow from the crown fragments that floated near the altar. His motive was simple and terrible. He did not want a kingdom. He wanted a doorway that only he could master, so he could reshape Black Hollow into a place where nothing could stand against him. He had used Ethan as his champion, bending a loyal knight through pain, darkness, and false duty, because a broken champion could walk where Thorn could not. Now the voice below threatened that control, and Thorn could not allow it to continue. Mara moved first. She darted across the broken floor with the speed of a scout who had survived too many bad roads, and she slid behind a fallen iron pillar before Thorn could fully turn. Her goal was not glory. It was survival, and she wanted Kael to have one clear path toward the sealed chamber. She raised two fingers and pointed down to the cracked seam in the floor where black dust puffed up with each tremor. Kael saw it at once. The voice was coming from beneath that weak place, and the hidden room was close enough to touch if they could break through before Thorn finished the crown. But Ethan stepped into their path, and the room changed again. He drew his blade with a slow, heavy motion, and the dark crystal veins in his armor pulsed like a trapped storm. His face was tight, not with anger alone, but with shame. He had heard the voice too, and it had reached some buried part of him that Thorn had failed to erase. "Do not make me stop you," Ethan said, and his voice sounded like a man asking for help while pretending to threaten. Kael did not answer with words. He brought up the null brand, and the dull silver light spread across the blade and his gauntlets. The relic always reacted when demon power was near, and now it shone brighter than before, as if the cathedral itself was feeding it danger. Thorn smiled thinly because he wanted this clash. He needed the room to focus on force while he completed the crown above him. Ethan attacked first, and the impact of their weapons sent a shock through the broken chamber. Kael was driven back one step, then another, but he held the line and used the null brand to strip the dark energy from Ethan's strike. The corruption around Ethan flickered, and for a brief second the knight seemed less like an enemy and more like a man waking from a bad dream. That was the opening Mara needed. She threw a line across the floor, hooked it to a cracked steel support, and yanked with all her weight. The support collapsed inward, and the cracked seam below it opened wider with a harsh groan. Cold air rushed up from the gap, carrying dust, old stone, and a sound that made Kael's skin tighten. Someone below was moving toward them. Then the floor split just enough for a hand to appear through the darkness. It was a human hand, pale with grime, and it gripped the edge like a survivor climbing from deep water. Kael stepped back and Mara froze because the sight was impossible and yet plain. A woman emerged slowly from the hidden chamber, and she looked older than the others expected, with white hair cut short around a tired face, a dark blue cloak torn at the hem, and simple black travel clothes worn thin from long years underground. Her name was Lena, and she was not a soldier or a priest. She had once been the keeper of the cathedral records, the woman who knew why the black steel cathedral had been sealed in the first place. Her eyes landed on Ethan first, and for a moment they filled with pain and relief at the same time. "I hid you here," she said to him, and the truth in those words hit harder than any blade. Ethan stumbled because he had believed he was Thorn's chosen champion from the beginning of his ruin. Now he heard that he had once been protected instead, hidden away as a child after the crown first began to corrupt the cathedral. Lena had taken him beneath the floor to keep him safe from the void, but the attack had changed everything. Thorn had found the chamber later, taken the boy, and twisted his memories until he became the weapon standing before them now. The revelation tore open the room. Ethan was not simply a corrupted knight. He was the last living seal tied to the prison below, and his blood had been used to help feed the gate. That was why the voice had called his name, and that was why the crown still needed him. Kael felt the weight of it settle in his chest. The fight was no longer about one gate or one villain. It was about a person who had been stolen from his own life and turned into a key. Thorn finally lost his calm. The broken crown frame above him flared with black light, and the crown fragments near the altar spun faster as he tried to force the gate open before Lena could speak again. "You are too late," he said, and his voice held no rage, only cold certainty. "This city was always going to be mine to remake." He did not say it with madness. He said it like a man who believed ruin was a fair price for order. He had watched Black Hollow rot after the war, watched families starve, watched towns empty, and he had decided that only absolute control could save the broken world from itself. But his answer was poison because he did not want healing. He wanted obedience through fear. Lena shook her head and stepped beside Kael, even while her knees trembled from weakness. She explained the final rule of the cathedral in simple words. The gate could not open fully unless the crown, the seal, and the living key all lined up at once. The crown pieces supplied the void power. The seal beneath the floor held back what waited below, and Ethan, shaped by both blood and corruption, was the living key that could unlock or close everything. Kael finally understood why the null brand had reacted so strongly. It was not just meant to strike demons, it was meant to cancel the crown long enough for the seal to be broken by choice instead of force. That choice would matter more than strength. Thorn raised both hands, and the shadows around the cathedral swelled as if the walls themselves were leaning inward. Ethan wavered, caught between the command of Thorn and the voice of the woman who had hidden him. Mara stepped beside him, her gaze sharp and steady, and she told him the one thing he needed to hear. He was not a weapon. He was a person, and he could choose where he stood. Ethan looked at the burning crown, then at Lena, then at Kael with the null brand shining in his grip. In that long, silent beat, the man he had been and the man Thorn had made collided inside him. His hand shook and the dark crystal veins across his chest pulsed once, hard and bright, as the cathedral floor groaned again and the hidden chamber below began to wake fully. Kael lifted the null brand toward the black light, Mara braced for the next strike, and Thorn smiled as if the final move had at last begun. Above them, the gate trembled. Below them, the buried chamber opened wider. And in the center of it all, Ethan made a choice that would decide whether Black Hollow would be saved or swallowed by the void. The black steel cathedral shook like a giant under siege, and the whole ruin seemed to breathe with a sick, deep sound. Black iron ribs arched above the broken floor, ash clung to every ledge, and cold light spilled through cracks in the walls like pale water. Kael stood in the center of that trembling chamber, his blackened steel armor dusted gray, his dark red cloak hanging heavy behind him, and his tired blue eyes locked on the black light rising from below. The null brand rested in his heavy iron gauntlets, its dull silver glow growing stronger as the hidden chamber opened wider. Mara stayed close at his side, her silver hair tied back beneath a torn green cloak, her lean body low and ready, her sharp eyes watching every shadow. She knew the truth was close now, and the truth mattered because Black Hollow could not survive another failure. Above them, the gate in the cathedral roof kept shaking. Below them, something old and terrible was waking. And in the middle of it all, Ethan stood with dark blonde hair falling across his troubled face, the dark crystal veins across his chest pulsing once more, hard and bright, while everyone waited to see whether he would fight the void or give in to it. Thorn watched from the far side of the chamber with cold calm, as if the whole scene belonged to him alone. He wore a long shadowed robe over black armor plates, and a broken golden crown frame floated above his head, turning slowly as faint void energy flickered inside the cracked metal. His pale gray skin and cold eyes made him look less like a man and more like a ruler carved from winter stone. He wanted the final gate because he believed Black Hollow had already been ruined by war, fear, and weakness. In his mind, the void was not only power. It was a clean ending and a new beginning, and he wanted to use the shattered crown pieces to bind that power to himself. He had spent years gathering broken relics, old blood oaths, and the fear of desperate people, because he was certain that a broken kingdom could only be rebuilt by something stronger than mercy. The truth of his plan now hung in the air like smoke. He did not just want to rule Black Hollow. He wanted to remake it in the shape of the void, and he believed that every life trapped inside the ruined land was a fair price. Lena stood half-hidden near a broken pillar below the stairway, her white hair falling around a tired face, her pale hands clenched around the edge of her torn dark blue cloak. She had lived underground for many years, guarding the old paths and the lost records, and she knew something that mattered more than fear. The buried chamber was not only a prison. It was also a lock, and the lock had been built to stop Thorn from opening the void gate that sat above the cathedral like a wound in the sky. Ethan heard Lena before anyone else could. Her voice was low, but it carried through the shaking stone. She told him the dark crystal veins in his chest were not a curse born from nothing. They were part of an old binding made long ago, when the first keepers tried to stop the void from entering Black Hollow. The crystals had entered him because he had been chosen as a vessel by force, then trained and twisted by Thorn until he became a champion who could carry the gate energy without breaking at once. That truth hit Ethan harder than any blow could have. He had believed the veins meant he had already been lost. He had believed the burn mark on his left arm was proof that he belonged to the dark power now. But Lena explained the deeper rule clearly. The crystals could be used to open the gate, or they could be used to seal it if Ethan chose to resist Thorn with all his will. That was why he mattered so much. His body had become the final key, but his heart still held a choice. Ethan looked at Kael, then at Mara, then at the ruined altar where the shattered crown pieces had started to rise from the stone like pieces drawn by a hidden hand. He remembered the people in the broken villages outside the cathedral, the ash roads, the empty homes, and the children who still waited behind boarded windows for someone to bring them hope. He remembered the commands of Thorn, the endless pressure, and the shame of obeying a man who called him useful but never called him human. Then he made his choice. He stepped backward from Thorn, clenched his hands, and turned the pulsing pain in his chest toward the gate instead of toward the cathedral floor. The chamber answered at once. A blast of black wind surged upward, and everyone inside the ruin felt the force slam through the air. Kael reacted first. He drove the null brand forward with both hands, and the iron relic flashed with a dull silver light that cut through the black wind. The blade did not burn like fire or crack like lightning. It simply canceled the dark force where it touched, as if the void itself forgot how to move. That was the true reason the null brand mattered. It was made to neutralize demon power, and it only worked when the wielder held steady long enough to trust its weight. Kael had once doubted that relic just as he had doubted himself, but this moment gave him no room for hesitation. He planted his boots against the shaking floor and forced the first wave away from Mara and Ethan. Mara moved at once, fast and silent, her silver hair whipping behind her as she leapt across broken stone to reach Lena. She had always been a scout, a watcher, and a survivor, but now she was more than that. She was the one person in the chamber who could move through the chaos and keep the truth alive. She pulled Lena away from a falling slab, then looked up and saw the shattered crown pieces orbiting above the altar in a slow spiral. Their gold, silver, and black stone surfaces glowed with faint void light, and she understood the danger at once. If Thorn gathered them, he could force the gate fully open. If Ethan lost control, the chamber would answer him instead. Thorn raised one hand and smiled. He was not angry at the betrayal. He expected it. That made him even more dangerous, because his confidence came from a plan built on pain, patience, and fear. Then the hidden chamber below the cathedral opened fully, and the floor split with a long, heavy groan. Stone steps appeared where none had been before, descending into a round vault wrapped in black chains and old runes. At the center of that vault stood an ancient ring of iron and bone-white stone, the true gate frame, waiting for the crown pieces to complete it. Lena cried out that the keepers had hidden the lower vault long ago because the gate could not be destroyed by force. It had to be starved, sealed, and watched forever. That was the reason no army had ever taken Black Hollow cleanly. The kingdom had not simply been lost in war. It had been trapped in a slow collapse because every generation had to guard the wound beneath it. Kael heard the truth and felt his heart turn hard with anger, not at the ruin itself, but at how many lives had been spent hiding this secret. Thorn then spoke in a voice that carried across the chamber like cold metal. He told Ethan that the crystals in his chest could still belong to something greater. He promised him control, purpose, and power if he would turn back and help complete the gate. He said the world outside Black Hollow was already cruel, already broken, and already ready to leave this kingdom to rot. Ethan shook with pain, but he did not move. His eyes stayed on Kael, and for the first time he looked like a man trying to become something better than the thing made from him. He drove both fists into the floor and forced the crystal veins to blaze. The vault lit up. The gate frame screamed with black light. Thorn finally lost his calm and stepped forward, reaching for the crown pieces as if he could still pull victory from the last second. Kael and Mara moved together not as strangers, but as people who had finally learned how to trust each other under fire. Mara shouted the next opening, and Kael answered it with the null brand. He cut through the ring of void energy, sending a clean silver pulse across the chamber, and two of the crown fragments fell from the air and struck the floor hard. Their glow faded for a moment, and that single break gave Ethan the opening he needed. He lifted his head, jaw tight, pain crossing his face, and he pushed all the crystal light inside him toward the gate instead of toward himself. The dark veins on his chest split with bright lines of pale energy, and the black wind began to reverse. The buried vault trembled, then shrank, as if the chamber itself was pulling closed around Thorn. But Thorn did not retreat yet. He grabbed one last crown fragment from the air, and the broken golden piece flared in his hand as he turned his cold eyes toward Kael. He spoke one final warning, saying that the gate was only the first door, and that the truth beneath Black Hollow was far older than anyone in the cathedral understood. Then the lower vault collapsed inward in a roar of dust and chain, forcing everyone to shield their faces and stagger back. When the darkness thinned, Thorn was no longer at the center. He had withdrawn into the far shadow of the opening, still calm, still dangerous, and still holding the last fragment of his plan. Ethan stood alone near the cracked gate frame, breathing hard, alive, free for the moment, and changed by the choice he had made. Kael looked at him with new respect, because the boy he had seen as a burden had become the reason the chamber did not swallow them all. Mara reached Lena and helped her steady herself, while Lena stared into the broken vault and whispered that the deepest part of Black Hollow had now been touched. Above them, the roof gate still trembled. Below them, something even older than the vault had begun to stir. And as Kael tightened his grip on the null brand, he knew the battle was not over yet, because Thorn had not come here to lose. He had come here to uncover what lay beyond the last seal, and that hidden truth was now only one step away from waking completely. The broken vault glowed with a weak, cold light, and the air around it felt heavy enough to press on the chest. Black Hollow lay in deep ruin around them, with ash roads, cracked stone, and ruined towers standing like tired guards under a sky split by a living void. The black steel cathedral loomed above the lower chambers, its black ribs bent and chained, while the roof gate trembled with each pulse from below. Kael stood near the edge of the shattered vault, a man with black hair, tired blue eyes, and blackened steel armor dusted with ash, and he kept the null brand tight in both heavy iron gauntlets because he knew the danger was not waiting anymore, it was waking. Beside him, Mara, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and a torn green cloak over light travel armor, steadied her breathing and watched every shadow because she had spent too many nights in dangerous places to trust silence. Lena, a woman with white hair, a worn dark blue cloak, and the tired face of someone who had guarded secrets for years, stared into the broken vault and whispered that the deepest part of Black Hollow had now been touched. That simple warning carried the whole weight of the story, because if the last seal failed, the buried force below would rise, and Thorn would use it to break the final wall between ruin and rule. Thorn stepped forward through the drifting dust, calm as if the danger belonged to someone else. He was a man with black hair, pale gray skin, and cold, commanding eyes, and his long, shadowed robe moved over black armor plates while the broken golden crown frame floated above his head. He did not look angry because anger was too messy for him. He looked certain because certainty was how he ruled fear. He had come to Black Hollow for one reason only, and that reason was power shaped into control. Thorn believed the hidden force below the vault was not a curse to be feared, but a key that could turn the whole broken kingdom into a weapon that would answer only to him. He had spent years gathering the shattered crown pieces, the gold, silver, and black stone fragments that still glowed with faint void energy, and he had used them to prepare the final gate inside the cathedral. He wanted the gate open because the thing below Black Hollow was older than the ruined kingdom itself, and he believed it could make him untouchable. Kael understood the logic of it even while he hated it. Thorn had been a man who learned that fear was easier to control than hope, and once he found a source of endless power, he would not stop at this one kingdom. He would spread ruin everywhere. Mara moved first, stepping to Kael's side and saying in a low voice that Thorn was not here to win a fight, he was here to finish a plan. Lena nodded once, then added that the last seal had not been built to hide treasure, but to trap something that even the old kings had not been able to destroy. That truth changed the shape of the danger because this was no longer only about stopping Thorn. It was about stopping the thing he was about to wake. Then Ethan came into view from the lower archway, and the sight of him made the whole chamber tighten with fear and pity at once. He was a man with dark blonde hair, a strong build, cracked old knight armor, and dark crystal veins crossing his chest, while a red burn mark marked his left arm like a bitter reminder of how far he had fallen. He had once been a proud champion, but corruption had taken hold of him and left him torn between command and shame. His face looked troubled, as if every step he took was split between obedience to Thorn and the last pieces of his own will. He raised his weapon, but the motion was not clean, and the dark crystal veins along his armor flashed in uneven pulses. Thorn did not even look at him for long. To Thorn, Ethan was not a partner, only a useful shield that could be thrown into danger while the true prize was claimed. That made Ethan matter even more, because it showed how far Thorn had gone to turn people into tools. Kael saw the pain in Ethan's eyes and did not rush in with anger. Instead, he lifted the null brand, and the relic gave off a dull silver light that pushed against the corruption in the air. The blade was iron, plain and heavy with old rune lines and a dark hilt, and its whole purpose was to neutralize demon power. When its light spread across the floor, the dark crystal veins on Ethan's armor flickered, and for one sharp second, Ethan looked like a man waking from a bad dream. Mara saw it too, and she shouted that they could still pull him back if they broke Thorn's hold fast enough. The chamber erupted in motion after that. Thorn lifted one hand, and the shattered crown pieces floating near the cathedral walls answered him with a harsh void glow. The air bent with pressure, and black lines crawled across the broken stone as if the cathedral itself were drawing breath. Ethan charged first, more from habit than choice, and Kael met him with the null brand in a bright clash of steel and cold light. The impact sent sparks across the floor, and Ethan stumbled back, not because he was weak, but because the relic cut through the dark force inside him and made his arm shake. Mara moved through the side ruins with fast, careful steps, using her scout skill to cut off the path toward the vault opening, while Lena rushed to a cracked control dais near the wall. She knew the old underground systems better than anyone alive, and she had spent years studying the hidden gates, waiting for the day she might have to use that knowledge. She called out that the roof gate would collapse if the lower seal broke, which meant the cathedral above would fall into the vault and bury everything under it. That warning raised the stakes again because the danger was not only waking below them but crushing the entire lower city if the structure failed. Thorn smiled at that, which was the worst part because he had planned for destruction from the start. He told them that collapse was acceptable as long as he could reach the power first. He had no loyalty to Black Hollow, no love for the people who once lived there, and no fear of turning a whole ruin into a throne room. Kael felt the weight of that cruelty and almost let the moment break him, but then he remembered why the Null brand had chosen him. It was not because he was the strongest man in the room. It was because he was the one willing to stand between ruin and everyone else. He pushed Ethan back with one heavy strike, then used the opening to force the corrupted champion away from the vault edge. Mara shouted Kael's name and threw a dark chain across the floor, pinning part of the broken machinery in place so Lena could work. Lena slammed her palm against an old iron panel, and hidden runes woke under the dust. For the first time, she told the whole truth. The last seal had been made by survivors of the Old Kingdom, not to hide a source of power, but to bind the voice below it. The thing under Black Hollow had once whispered to kings, promising them victory, but every ruler who listened had become greedy, cruel, and blind. That was why the vault existed. The hidden force did not need worship, it needed invitation. Thorn had never understood that the crown pieces were not keys by themselves. They were fuel. He had been feeding the gate with pieces of broken royalty, trying to make a throne for a power that would never serve anyone honestly. Kael realized the truth at once, and so did Mara. If the gate opened fully, Thorn would not control the thing below. He would only give it a way out. That revelation hit the chamber harder than any strike. Even Ethan froze because a small part of his clear mind understood what he had nearly helped unleash. The roof gate above them shuddered again, and dust rained down in long gray streams. Deep below, something huge rolled in the dark, slow and waking. Thorn, however, did not retreat. He spread his hands and pressed his will into the crown frame, forcing more void light into the final seal. He was no fool. He understood the risk perfectly. He simply believed he was strong enough to command it. That belief made him dangerous because he would rather doom the world than admit he could not rule it. Kael moved toward him, the Null brand lighting brighter as it drank in the corrupted force around the seal. Mara covered his flank and kept Ethan from striking again, while Lena redirected the old systems to delay the gate collapse for just a little longer. For a brief moment, the four of them moved like a single team, each one holding a different piece of the same broken hope. Kael reached the inner ring of the vault and saw the final seal crack like thin glass. Below it, a black pulse rose from the hidden depth, and the chamber answered with a low hum that shook the floor. Thorn turned toward Kael with a cold, patient stare, and he said that the truth had finally been found. He said it as if that alone made him the winner. Kael tightened his grip, set his feet, and prepared to drive the Null brand into the crack before the hidden force could fully wake. But the pulse below swelled once more. Ethan stepped forward with shaking hands, and Lena suddenly shouted that the seal was not only breaking, it was opening from both sides. In that instant, Kael understood that this battle had just entered its most dangerous stage, and the next move would decide whether Black Hollow was saved or swallowed whole. The black steel cathedral shook like a giant beast trapped under stone, and every iron rib above the heroes groaned under the strain. Ash drifted through the broken arches, the melted statues cast long, crooked shadows, and the air felt cold enough to bite skin. Kael stood in the center of the shattered hall with his blackened steel armor dusty and heavy, his dark red cloak hanging behind him like a torn banner. He held the Null brand in both gauntleted hands, and the old iron blade gave off a dull silver glow that pushed back the dark pulse below. Around him, Mara kept low near a broken pillar, her silver hair tied back under a torn green cloak, her sharp eyes moving across every cracked wall and hanging chain. Lena stood close to the floor seal, her white hair pale in the dim light, her tired face tight with fear and hard knowledge. Ethan stepped forward from the far side of the chamber, his dark blonde hair matted with ash, his cracked armor pulsing with dark crystal veins, and his red burn mark shining as if it still hurt. Thorn watched them all from the highest dais, his black hair still, his long shadowed robe resting over black armor plates, and the broken golden crown frame floating above his head like a wound made of gold. He looked calm, cold, and sure that the end had already chosen him. The danger was clear to everyone now because the seal was not only breaking from below, it was also being forced open from above by the crown fragments Thorn had gathered. If the gate fully woke, Black Hollow would not be safe, and no one in that ruined kingdom would be able to stop the void from pouring through. Kael lowered his center of balance and tried to drive the null brand into the crack, but the floor pushed back with a hard tremor that nearly threw him off his feet. Lena raised a hand and shouted for him to wait because she had finally understood what her long years underground had taught her. The seal had been built with 2 locks, not one, and each lock had been tied to a different power. One lock had been made to hold the void below, and the other had been made to answer the crown above. That meant Thorn had not simply been breaking the seal by force. He had been feeding it with the shattered crown pieces so the lower gate would open in the exact shape he wanted. Mara heard that and turned sharply toward Lena because now the whole plan made cruel sense. Thorn had not come to Black Hollow just to destroy a kingdom. He wanted the gate alive, wide, and stable, because only a stable gate could let him control the void power instead of being consumed by it. He had learned long ago that raw corruption was wild, but a complete crown seal could shape it like a weapon. That was why he had hunted crown fragments across the ruined land, why villages had been burned, and why every surviving guardian had been driven into hiding. Thorn wanted a throne made from fear, and the void was the key he believed could open it. His motive was not random evil. It was greed, control, and the hunger to turn a broken world into his personal kingdom. Ethan took one more step forward, and his shoulders shook as if he were fighting 2 battles at once. The corrupted champion had once been one of the best knights of Black Hollow, brave and admired, but the dark crystal veins across his chest had changed him into a weapon Thorn could point at the people he once protected. Yet even now, the man inside him was not gone. Kael saw it in the way Ethan kept lowering his sword instead of raising it, and in the pain that flashed across his face each time the pulse beneath the floor grew stronger. Mara saw it too, and she moved from cover to stand where Ethan could see her clearly. She spoke his name in a steady voice and told him that he was still here, still fighting, and still able to choose. That simple trust hit harder than any blade. Ethan clenched his jaw, then pressed his burned left arm against the cracked armor on his chest as if he were trying to pin his own mind in place. Through the crack in the stone, a black glow rolled upward in thick waves, and a low sound like distant drums filled the cathedral. Thorn lifted one hand and smiled for the first time because he could feel the seal shifting the way a fisherman feels a line pull tight. He told them that resistance was already too late, that the crown would finish the pattern, and that the void below would answer him as its true heir. Then he sent a pulse through the floating crown frame, and the broken pieces on the floor began to rise in a slow circle around the seal. Kael understood at once that if even one more fragment locked into place, the gate would widen. He also understood that the null brand had to be used at the perfect moment, or its neutralizing power might only freeze the crack while trapping everyone inside the cathedral with the waking force. Mara moved first. She ran along the broken edge of the hall with a scout workmanlike grace, her brown boots slipping once on ash before she caught herself and sprang to a lower ledge. Her job was clear now. She had to reach the shattered crown pieces before they completed the ring. Lena pointed to a narrow iron stair hidden behind a fallen wall panel, and Mara took it without wasting a breath. Thorn noticed her move, and a wave of dark force flung iron chains across her path. She ducked under one chain, rolled under another, and kept going with a fierce look that said fear had not beaten her yet. Kael saw the opening she made and knew the whole fight had changed. He could not simply attack the crack. He had to synchronize with the others because the seal was responding to both Thorn and the lower void at once. Lena stepped beside him and explained the final rule of the seal in quick, tense words. The 2 locks were bound by living intent, not just stone and magic. If one side was forced alone, the other side would surge harder. If the crown completed the ring, the void would rush upward. If the lower seal was broken first, the crown would pull the gate open from above. That meant the only safe path was to break the chain between them and overwhelm the pattern from both ends at the same time. Kael listened, and for the first time since the battle began, he saw why Lena had stayed hidden so long. She was not a coward. She was the last keeper of a truth that everyone else had forgotten. She had spent years underground because she knew that speaking too early would only help Thorn prepare the final opening. Now, with the cathedral shaking apart and the crown pieces rising, her knowledge had become the key to survival. Ethan suddenly screamed, not in pain but in resistance, and the dark crystal veins across his chest lit like cracks under hot glass. Thorn had pushed too hard, and the command inside Ethan had begun to break apart. Kael saw his chance and moved toward him, not away. He slammed the flat side of the null brand against Ethan before the corrupted force could fully rise, and the blade flashed with a cold silver light that swallowed the black glow around the night. Ethan staggered, then fell to one knee, clutching the floor with both hands. For one terrible second, the whole hall went silent. Then Ethan looked up, and the man in him surfaced through the corruption with a frightened, honest stare. He told Kael that Thorn had used the crown shards to keep him obedient, and that every time the pulse below grew stronger, it also fed the thing inside his chest. This was the twist that changed everything. Ethan was not simply a broken enemy. He was the living lock Thorn had used to balance the seal from above, because his corrupted body had been made to carry part of the crown pattern. If he fell completely, the gate would finish opening. Kael felt the weight of that truth settle in his armor, and he knew the fight had become far larger than one duel. Thorn wanted not only the kingdom, but also the body and will of his own champion to serve as the final link between crown and void. Kael made his choice in that same heartbeat. He told Ethan to hold on, and he told Mara to keep moving. Then he planted his feet, raised the null brand toward the crack, and prepared to strike with everything he had left. Mara reached the rising crown fragments and cut through the first black thread of energy that held them together, but the burst threw her back against a wall of iron chain. She gritted her teeth, got up again, and forced her way toward the next piece. Lena rushed to her side and used her knowledge of the old seal markings to show where each fragment had to be broken free. The two women worked in sharp rhythm, one moving fast and one seeing clearly, and every shattered link made the cathedral tremble harder. Above them, Thorn grew less calm. His cold eyes narrowed, and his floating crown frame spun faster as he fed more power into the gate. He spoke with a quiet voice that carried too well through the hall, saying that all of them were only delaying what had already been promised to him. He believed the void had chosen him because he was willing to rule through fear, and because he had never once mistaken mercy for strength. Kael almost answered, but then the floor split wider under his boots, and the black pulse below surged up so hard that the null brand nearly slipped from his hands. Ethan saw the danger and threw his shoulder into Kael at the exact right moment, helping steady the blade. That simple act mattered more than any speech. The corrupted champion had chosen to help the man he had once been ordered to destroy. Kael felt the blade align with the crack, and he knew the opening move had arrived. Yet just as he drew back to strike, Lena shouted from across the hall that one last crown fragment was not in the circle at all. It was hidden above them, inside the broken crown frame over Thorn head, and if it was not removed now, the seal would finish opening no matter what they did below. Kael looked up, saw the hidden piece glowing inside the frame, and understood that the next move would not only decide the battle. It would decide who among them was brave enough to reach the source before the void answered. He tightened his grip, set his feet once more, and the story moved toward its most dangerous second, with the cathedral ready to break wide open. The black steel cathedral shuddered under a sky split by moving darkness, and cold ash drifted through broken ribs of iron and stone. Kael stood on a cracked bridge below the high frame, his black armor dusty, his tired blue eyes locked upward. Above him, Thorn hovered with calm control, and the broken crown frame around his head pulsed with void light. If that hidden piece stayed in place, the seal would finish opening, and the last safe land beyond the ruins would be lost to the dark. Mara, the silver-haired scout, moved along a narrow ledge with careful steps. She wanted one clear path to the crown because she knew speed was their only chance. Lena, the white-haired keeper, stayed low beside a fallen pillar and shouted the old truth she had guarded for years. The crown was not only a prison key, it was also a lock, and Thorn had twisted it to feed the gate. Ethan, the dark blonde champion, clenched his cracked armor and fought the pull of corruption because he still wanted to prove that he could stand on the right side before it was too late. Kael gripped the null brand, and the iron blade gave off a dull silver glow as he pushed forward. Thorn spoke with a cold, sure voice, and he said the void would bring order to a broken world. He had chosen this path because he believed hope had always failed and only the dark could make a kingdom strong again. That truth hit harder than any blade because it meant Thorn was not confused. He was convinced. Then Lena revealed the last missing piece. The hidden crown fragment had once come from the cathedral below, and it had been used to trap a living hunger that fed on fear. Thorn had not built a gate by accident. He had rebuilt a feast. At that moment, Ethan made his choice. He drove himself between Thorn and the crown frame, forcing the corrupted power in his chest to flare wide and stall the seal for a few more breaths. Mara reached the frame from above, snatched the glowing hidden piece and tossed it down to Kael. Kael caught it, slid the shard into the null brand, and the relic answered with a hard silver flash that broke the void link. Thorn staggered back as the crown frame split and collapsed in black sparks. The cathedral groaned, then began to settle instead of open. The dark sky above Black Hollow dimmed, and the seal held at last. Ethan dropped to one knee, shaken but free of the worst corruption, while Lena placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Mara gave Kael a small, proud smile, and for the first time, Kael did not feel alone in the ruins. He had entered the cathedral as a lone fighter, but he left it as a leader who trusted others. Behind them, Thorn vanished into the falling shadow, defeated for now, while the black steel cathedral stood broken, silent, and no longer a door to the void.